We are just running out of space here. So, we're going to have to do a little bit of rearranging. That should do for now. Do you ever read a book and then ask yourself,
what did I just read? What was this book even about?
But in a good way. Today we are reviewing Mercy, Tears of the Fallen by Chance Dillon. And honestly, I don't even know how I'm going to give a summary and an overview of this book. It was so complex, I don't even think the book had enough room to tell the full story. But we'll do our best. At its core, I think this is a story about an empire recovering from a deadly invasion. Not only were they at war physically, but these intruders also brought with them a plague that turned their water red and poisoned people into becoming these zombie creatures. Now they are rebuilding this fractured and hobbled empire, but this mysterious plague seems to be getting stronger. This plague that they thought that they had eradicated. And as time passes, more and more people are hunting for ancient artifacts left behind by these gods that basically saved them from this plague. And power and vengeance drive these characters into thicker mysteries and devastation. Hopefully that does it some justice, but without further ado, let's dive into this indie review. Let's kick things off with the Immersion, which I gave a 10 out of 10. To me, this is the best kind of world building. The kind where they don't tell you what anything is. And it's very much a sink or swim type of book. And you kind of just have to figure it out as you go along. You've got dozens of different races throughout this world with unique characteristics and abilities. Each of them basically had a patron artisan, which was like their version of a god or immortal. You have hierarchies within this empire and within the orders of magic. There are so many varied landscapes, from mountain cities to swamps to caverns to palaces to ships to the ocean. And you've also just got such a rich history throughout this story. This story takes place after what they call the Reckoning, which was like an invasion of these zombie-like creatures that I mentioned earlier that essentially were responsible for wiping out all of these artisans. And it was started by this crimson disease that destroyed their technology and their achievements, and it forced them to drink water through filters for the rest of their lives. So it's just got a really complex past and history that we are literally just thrown into, and we have to pick up these pieces of what has happened to them and why they're in their current state as we kind of dive into the story. There's discrimination against people who have been touched by this crimson disease. Even though they weren't turned into zombies, they still bear the marks of these red veins and these red marks on their skin that show that they are redborn or vileborn, or all these other terms for this group of people. They're reminders of this devastation and of this plague. There are political maneuverings between different kingdoms, I guess you could call them, within this empire. There's rumors of a rebel king amassing a huge force of these redborn and vileborn. There are assassinations, ambushes, artifacts, and there are almost really two worlds within this world. And we as the reader spend all of our time in this empire that is trying to recover. But the invaders who destroyed this continent and this empire come from a far north land called Mercy. And no one from this empire has ever traveled there and returned. There are some people from that country or that continent that have stayed after the war, but that's pretty much it. And they usually don't talk about their homeland of Mercy. They do very briefly, but not a lot. And just the way that this was written for me made the world so tangible and inviting because of its complexity and just allowing me to try and figure things out as I went along through the story. I really appreciated that, even though it was super complex. Next up, we have the names and the characters of this story, which I had to give a 9.5 out of 10. You have basically a lot of morally gray characters and complex motivations with everyone in this story. So there are several POVs, but I would say the two main POVs that we follow is Erevane. He basically has this tragic past, which leads to a lot of, drinking, mistakes in the army, and those problems that his decisions lead him to costs him his ability to wield magic. So his story and his arc is a lot about his journey to overcome this exile and essentially get revenge on the people who destroyed his life. And then the second POV that is, I would say, the main POV is Alavist. And this person ends up becoming one of Eravain's mentors. But he definitely has his own ambitions and quests for his own vengeance. He was a legend. He's one of these people that were the greatest warriors and magic wielders during the Reckoning. And he basically could have been, a king or a leader of a group of people, but he just didn't want to do that. He just wanted to live a life in peace with his family. But now, the Alavist that we know in this current state is just reduced to a base hatred that drives all of his actions and decisions. And there are, like I said, a lot of other POVs that help to add depth and context throughout the story. And there was not a single character to me that felt shallow or uninteresting. You've got Salismir, Viala, Ilteria, Haid, Marin. You know the story is good when you just want to keep learning more about these people and you never feel like you quite get enough. You only kind of get crumbs, hints, and scraps along the way, and it just makes you want to learn more, which I think is a good trait in a book. You want your readers to have some desire to learn more rather than answering all their questions. That's my personal preference, but I thought it was really great. Now let's talk about Demagic, which I gave a 9 out of 10. I would call this something between a hard and a soft magic system. There are hard rules for how their power is accessed, but it's not always clear what those actual powers that they access can do. Like, there's some, but there's just so many orders to the different types of magic that we only really get a taste of a few of them. And even then, you don't have a full comprehension of, like, what this magic is capable of. We just kind of see it in action as we go along. So there are 9 forms of magic. Some can be used to create technology or illusions, while others can access elemental magic, and some can even suppress the magic in other magic users, and that's what makes Eravain an exile. Now, typically magic users have to learn 1 or 2 of these forms, but the past wielders of this magic in Alavist Day had to learn multiple forms. And bloodlines also play a role in how the magic is able to be accessed and the potency of that magic. There are forbidden magics of blood and chaos. And then, of course, this crimson magic, which turned people into those zombie creatures that came from the northern lands of Mercy. And, of course, there are these powerful artifacts called tears, hence Tears of the Fallen. The Fallen being the artisans who died during the invasion. When these artisans died, they were able to basically channel all of their magic and energy and life force into these artifacts called tears, which could be used to basically plant into the earth somewhere or hide somewhere to dispel the magic from the elements and nature itself. So these artifacts hold incredible power, and it was the only thing that could relinquish this scourge of this Crimson Plague. So naturally, people forget that that's the case, and they're very interested in what happened to these tears and how they can get their hands on them to use for their own personal gains. Moving on to the infrastructure, which I gave an 8.5 out of 10. Now, the reason why I gave this an 8.5 is because I felt like we were building to a very specific climax throughout the story, and I felt like it never really comes to fruition. So yes, it does subvert our expectations, but I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing, at least not for me. It kind of made the climax feel a little bit diminished, even with all of the cool reveals that came with the climax and the conclusion. But you know that I like when indie authors take risks with their books and do different things, and one of the things that Tears of the Fallen does is it actually has like 3 chapters kind of as a prologue, and I like that.
For those of you who don't like prologues, I'm probably going to do a rant video at another time, but I love prologues, and if you don't, you can just skip the prologues, so stop denying the rest of us access to these prologues and these histories. I like them.
But I liked that that was part of the story. I think it added depth, and I think it needed all 3 of those chapters to really set the tone for the rest of this story. So very unique, very brave thing to do, because I know how people can be very particular about prologues. Now, another issue that I had was there were moments to me that felt unnecessarily repetitive. And it just felt so out of place with this level of complexity. Now, the one example that kind of really stood out to me more than others, but it did happen several times, but this one example like really stuck to me is when Haid is making arrows with his sister in that village. And he mentions that they wipe their blood on the arrow shafts as they're making them like 6 times within that same chapter. All while we have no idea what their past is or how they're planning to approach their current circumstances. So because of the level of complexity, it just feels like wasted space that I want to be used and leveraged for better information. Like, I either want more character depth, I want more reveals about history, whatever it is, but I don't need to be told 6 times about their actions that they're doing in the moment. I don't care that much. It's enough to set the scene, but doing it that repetitive and that often kind of was annoying to me. Not enough to take me out of the story, but from an infrastructure perspective, I think that is something that if you're going to do a complicated, complex story like this, you have to remove any repetition, because then it becomes a point of frustration for the reader. But overall, the pacing kept me very intrigued, even though it was super difficult to wrap my head around all the things that were going on. There was a good balance of action and emotion and introspection throughout all the scenes. And the plot was just constantly evolving and just kept me guessing all the way to the end of the book. Now, my enjoyment of this book was a 9 out of 10. And honestly, this might have been a timing thing. The timing of this book in my TBR and where I'm at right now in my fantasy reading journey, I think was just perfect. I think had I read Mercy, Tears of the Fallen a year ago, or as a less experienced fantasy reader, my enjoyment would have been a 5 because of its complexity. But I've read so many books recently that feel like they're just holding my hand so much. It was almost like this was exactly what I asked for as a breath of fresh air against all of those other kind of watered down, hold your hand type fantasy books. So this was super challenging for me to read, but it was still an exciting book, and it was an exciting challenge. And I haven't read the Malazan series, but I imagine it would feel something like this. And I think that's what people have compared it to. And surprisingly, it makes me more inclined to read the Malazan series. I've always been super intimidated by it because of how much people say it's so complicated and the depth is really difficult to get into and you really don't know what's going on as you're reading the book. But if it's anything like this, I think it would be worth the effort. So I'm glad that I got that kind of exposure to this style of writing in this complex fashion. This is one of those books that I just feel has a really unique premise, a distinguishable prose, and just intricate depth to the world building. So even though it was incredibly challenging for me to read, I was glad that I was able to accept that challenge at this point in my fantasy reading career? I don't think it's a career. Experience? I don't know. So with that being said, that leaves Mercy, Tears of the Fallen with a cover-facing score of 9.2 out of 10. But let me be very clear. This book is not for everyone. For instance, I would not jump from Mistborn to this book. But if you like Malazan, if you like Game of Thrones, then I think a book like this might be more up your alley. It is not an easy read. At least for me, it wasn't. You will have questions, and it will be frustrating at times. But I feel like if you just let it all wash over you, understanding does come as you read the story. At least to a degree, anyway. Enough that you can enjoy it. So keep that in mind. Just because I really enjoyed it, and this was a 9 out of 10 for me, I understand why some people might have a much harder time enjoying a fantasy story like this. So I just want to be super upfront, where this is like a very unique 9 out of 10 for me personally. I think it executed everything really, really well. But I also understand how this could be a very challenging and turn people off to this style of complexity. But if you're open to a challenge, I would definitely recommend giving this one a read. Okay, now let's judge a book by the cover, shall we? I personally love these types of covers because it's symbolic, it's visceral, and it just has an epic feel to it. And I like that it's a little bit different from a lot of the other fantasy art styles. You all know I love Jeff Brown covers and artwork, but it's nice to see different styles as well and have a little bit of variety for the shelf. I also want to mention that the formatting is fantastic. The map is excellent, very easy to read. It also has artwork kind of throughout the book, so you get little images kind of throughout, which is also kind of cool to see that in an indie book. You don't see that very often, so I can appreciate that. Like this, like it's not printed super well, like the black and white is a little bit faded, but again, I can appreciate that an indie author was able to spend money on artwork for their book. Like, that's pretty cool. The chapter headers are all formatted super well. So yeah, overall, just really great book, great design. So let's go ahead and get this one added to the shelf. We've got ourselves another cover facing. Pretty cool. Now, we are going to be upgrading the shelf soon in the studio because we did get those 1,000 subscribers, so we'll have a lot more room for books moving forward. But for now, things are getting a little bit cramped up there. So if there's any other 9 out of 10s, we're going to have a problem. But that'll do it for today's review. If you like this video, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to join the Indie Fantasy Club. And check out some of my other book reviews to see what other indie recommendations you can add to your TBR. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.